Heart of a Game Ranger.
CD 2. Track 37.
Try to picture the scene, as I believe Craig would have in that instance. 6 wide-eyed black mamba trainees running in one direction, 5 terrified lions in the other, and a dead kudu in the middle. The faint cloud of dust, kicked up in panic, now gently settling as the grunts and growls from the lions and shrieks and squeals from the young women fade away, swallowed by the bush. Given his experience with wildlife, Craig knew the ladies were relatively safe. There'd be no real danger to them. As long as the lions had a huge kudu to eat, they would be intent on their meal, with little interest in attacking anyone. In fact, the lion's initial reaction was to run away in the opposite direction, as wild lions invariably do in surprise confrontations with human beings. Then, with the ladies having left the scene, the lions would undoubtedly have returned to their kill the moment everything had settled. But clearly not everyone there understood lion ecology. Craig simply couldn't help himself. To the mambas, however, his laughter on the radio signified a lack of caring or not taking their safety seriously. They were so shaken and upset. Their fear had now turned to anger, and it was directed at him. Tears flowed down their dusty cheeks for the second time that day as they openly cried on parade that afternoon. But they showed their commitment once again and reported for duty the next day, on time and parade ready. Most importantly for Craig, they even made a little play about the lion incident, which I suspect was much funnier than the real experience. Being natural-born recitalists, the mambas took the few weeks of training they'd had on the search, seizure, and arrest of a suspect one step further. Acting the likely scenarios out, they were able to bring out the humour in what was essentially a serious and dangerous part of their job. Basic courtroom procedure was also turned into a soap opera, where each took their part seriously, rehearsing their lines well. No doubt little was forgotten this way. Eager to put all this theory and play acting into meaningful action, the mambas couldn't wait to start with their advanced bushcraft and tactical training. This was the paramilitary aspect of the training program, and there could be no compromises or concessions made for the fairer sex. Physically, it would prove to be the most difficult part of the course, and they expected nothing less. The course took place in the heart of Big Five country and included full-moon foot patrols, living in the bush without washing for 12 days, sitting up in ambush positions quietly for hours on end, and sleeping under the stars. Dry, military-style rations, rat packs, and bottled borehole water was all they had for sustenance. When on patrol and the water they carried ran out, there was little option but to drink from the water holes utilized by game. The cornucopia of aromas surrounding these water holes and the muddy flavour of the water are secondary considerations when you are hot and thirsty. And though a few trainees fainted from the exertion, not a single one became ill or dropped out. A particularly poignant example of fortitude sticks in Craig's mind. Despite having attained a remarkable level of fitness, one young mamba fainted on their last opfok, fuck-up run. This was a grueling 17-kilometre run in the heat of the day, a final test of endurance and willpower before qualifying. The careful monitoring, constant roadside assistance and regular offers to quit at any time simply made this particular candidate more determined not to quit. Helping her up and cooling her down with cold water, Craig offered to take her back. She refused and adamantly told him to go away, before the others thought she was softer than them. She continued and finished the run in the time allotted. Their passing out parade was a happy occasion. and many tears of pride and joy were shed amid ululating and impromptu harmonious singing that sent goosebumps down our spines. They humbled Craig almost to tears himself. Or was he simply using his shirt sleeves to wipe a couple of those irritating little mapani flies out of his eyes, as he told everyone? When the time came to say a word or two about the Mambas, he congratulated them all on their determination and commitment. Then, in conclusion, made a point of singling out this young cadet and giving her a deserved accolade. When he'd finished, the young lady stepped forward and gave a speech that Craig told me would forever burn in his brain. She said, "When I finished 12 years of school, I thought I was going places. Then after some years of waiting and never getting any jobs, I felt let down and thought my whole life I would be in the village carrying firewood and water cans. Today I am special. I am part of a serious thing." With that, and not a mapani fly in sight, she started to cry, unable to speak any more. Today, having literally earned her stripes, she runs the operations room and is the Black Mamba's unit staff sergeant. Little could she, or anyone else there at the time, have known just how serious this thing would become. But the rest of the world would let the Mambas know soon enough. Having an extensive boundary with the R40 roadway, Olifants West had always been plagued by bushmeat poachers and petty theft. It was just so easy for them to hit and run before anything could be done, and as a result the incidents appeared to be escalating. However, the first 6 Mambas proved to be so effective in chasing the poachers out and disrupting their treacherous trade with early detection of incursions that Craig decided to roll out and recruit another 20 young women. Advertising was done by word of mouth, literally. The first 6 Mambas were sent out to canvass for cadets in their respective villages. Less than 24 hours later, Craig had a sea of keen, young black women standing at his headquarters. His Mambas had been sent forth to multiply, and indeed they had done just that. There were so many prospective candidates that he couldn't count them all. His work now cut out for him, Craig began the lengthy task of interviewing each one. To assist him, he had the 6 Mambas set up the most relevant questions. Having been through the training, they could help with the process of elimination by explaining the subtle nuances to the applicants in their native Tsonga. This oiled the process no end, and in so doing helped Craig select the most likely 20 trainees in far less time than he'd anticipated. The Mambas helped with the basic induction training of the new recruits for the first fortnight. This was an all-important preparation phase prior to the survival course and tactical field ranger training, which now included basic firearm training. Although they were primarily employed in non-combatant roles, musketry training was necessary in order that the Mambas understood and respected firearms. None of the women had ever used a gun. Some quite literally did not know which way the rifles needed to be pointed. As this was proving to be quite a shenanigans, safety training was made a priority. Persistence paid off, and their musketry skills have improved to a point where most are proficient, and others are pretty skilled markswomen now. Next to learning how to operate a two-way radio and associated radio procedure, teaching the Mambas to drive in the bush proved to be one of the most difficult aspects of their training. Despite Craig's perseverance, patience, and neutral attitude, after 3 years of trying, he still can't find the Mamba who is able to drive a 4x4 through the bush without using it as a paint marker for trees. The Black Mambas are primarily non-combatant. They are not trained to use lethal force and, as is true of their namesake, will only strike when provoked. Essentially, these women are not trained to be manhunters. While catching poachers is certainly high on their list of aspirations, it is not the main thrust of the program. Rather, the intention has always been to use Baluli Private Nature Reserve as a platform to develop a sense of responsibility and pride towards wildlife among the local tribal folk and communities. Having the Mambas working on the reserve for 21 days at a time gave us a captive audience that could be motivated and moulded. There was no script or mission statement to subscribe to. It was a dogma they developed of their own volition, like a set of values, a talent and sense of worth that has lain dormant and has only now been discovered. This ethic is entrenched in their personas, and they have become staunch ambassadors for the wilderness and its wildlife. This mindset is taken home with them, infecting their children, extended family, and friends. Imagine a little further down the line, when in 2 generations' time the Mambas are the elders in their respective villages, looking after their children's children. Never mind the technology, television and social media, nothing will ever replace a one-on-one bedtime story from Grandma. Anecdotal accounts involving wildlife, of when they were charged by black rhino, elephant and buffalo, and how these animals were merely doing what nature decreed. How fear and ignorance were replaced with respect and love, which culminated in an empathy and desire to conserve nature in all its forms. This is what will be related and passed down daily, something even David Attenborough's excellence could not do as effectively. Under the guidance of the late Jason Sherwood and Johan Grobbelaar, who were their training officer and regional warden respectively, the Mambas continued to impress by making significant inroads into the poaching gangs that appeared to have free rein on the notorious state-owned Doreen. Here they thwarted meat and muti poachers, who were either sent packing or arrested, and removed hundreds of their deadly cable and wire snares. News of these achievements, and with it the Mambas' reputation, began to spread and get noticed beyond our immediate environs. As to their achievements to date, this list briefly reads as follows. South African Rhino Awards 2015. The Black Mambas received 3 nominations in various categories and 1 in the category of Best Rhino Practitioner. They received their prize from Prince Albert of Monaco at a ceremony in Johannesburg. New York City 2015. The Black Mambas were awarded the honor of Champions of the Earth by the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP. Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary-General, personally congratulated each one and handed them their prize. The Black Mambas were invited to lunch with and to form a guard of honor for President Jacob Zuma at Skukuza in 2015. London 2016. Overseas again, the jet-setting Black Mambas were given an award by an NGO called Helping Rhinos. March 2016. The Black Mambas were invited to attend a conference in The Hague, where issues surrounding the illegal trade in wildlife and wildlife products were discussed. The Mambas spoke on the topic of community and national park cooperation. Toward the end of 2016, it was announced that a Hollywood production company plans to turn their story into a feature film. Sky News planned to give the Black Mambas a 2-minute slot on 21 January 2016. So fascinated was the interviewer that protocol was disregarded, and Craig Spencer, speaking on behalf of the Mambas, was not cut short. Instead, he was allowed to talk for more than 9 minutes. Apparently this was unheard of. Apart from these world travels, the Mambas have been mentioned in several presidential and parliamentary speeches in South Africa, and were invited to meet with Sally Jewell, U.S. Secretary for the Interior, which unfortunately they could not accept owing to logistics. They have dined with the Prince of Monaco, with Clara Michel, wife of Nelson Mandela, with Ban Ki-moon of the United Nations, and a few other dignitaries. A long haul from sweat-soaked bush fatigues, dry rations, and drinking from waterholes. Rhino Rescue Project, page 267. There is no need to elaborate on the already thought-provoking state of affairs regarding what is happening to our country's rhino. However, there is a need to share with the reader some of what we, as a reserve, have tried to do in order to become more proactive in waging this war against poaching. Rather than always responding reactively, desperately trying to close the door when the horse is already bolted, we started to pursue some of the innovative ideas that came to the fore. And just when we thought we'd considered everything, gone down every avenue, new side streets lit up, begging to be explored. There was a time when people, I believe Leonardo da Vinci was one, hid incredible scientific discoveries from the world for fear of religious retribution. Today, there are some who use science instead of religion as a screen to prevent sticking their necks out, for fear of failure and criticism from their peers. Sheep-like, they are unaware that an integral part of science, particularly the natural sciences, involves delving into the unknown and testing the untried. Enter a young Boerameisie, farm girl, who, impassioned by the brutal slaughter of rhino on her father's farm, put her slender shoulders behind the wheel of rhino conservation. Lorinda Hearn managed to put into practice what many had only thought about, had only uttered in hushed tones, behind closed doors and in dark, secret places. Her Rhino Rescue Project, RRP, pioneered the treating of rhino horn with non-lethal toxins and an indelible dye. Basically, the idea was to contaminate the horn and render the material unfit for its intended end users, but without any adverse effect on the rhino. Many rhino owners were skeptical, and most remained vehemently against tampering with rhino horn in their stockpiles, or on their living animals for that matter. I suspect this is driven primarily by prospects of profit. Many rhino owners and ranchers, and the government with its valuable stockpile of rhino horn from the Kruger National Park, were concerned that if the trade in rhino horn was to become legal, there would be dire financial implications for their uncontaminated stockpiles, which they are hoping to sell. Any sign or rumour of poisoned horns would kill the market, so in some respects it is understandable they remained negative. Then, to add to the critics' ammunition, the first televised demonstration to promote RRP's treatment went tragically wrong, when the subject rhino being worked on died on camera. The old rhino bull was later found to have had a heart defect, something no one could have foreseen. Despite this huge PR setback on national television, Lorinda remained committed. In fact, she was more determined than before. At the same time, I was more aware than ever of the need to look at the bigger picture in terms of anti-poaching measures. We had to do something a little out of the box. An unfortunate mishap could not be allowed to deter our optimism about the concept. Armed military-type and anti-poaching patrols were not enough, we knew, while being part of the Greater Kruger system and under their policy regarding dehorning meant this was not an option either. Sacrifices in another sphere needed to be made. This was ground-breaking technology, which was not fully understood, and trials were in their infancy. Understandably, there were many cynics and critics at the outset, and there are those who will remain sceptical. But with the extinction of a species at stake, there was no time to bother with protocol.
Track 38.
We were aware that there were, and still are, many unknowns regarding this treatment in terms of its efficacy and longevity. Needless to say, it was always going to be a huge leap of faith, in spite of which the board of Olifants Game Reserve put their trust and support behind the proposal, as did Sabi Sands Game Reserve and Hoedspruit Air Force Base. It was given the unequivocal go-ahead and a proposal was tabled. This was presented to the committee and received unanimous acceptance. RRP would treat at least 20 of Baluli's rhino. However, the Kruger National Park watched with only casual interest and were sceptically against the concept from the get-go. In my experience, if an idea does not originate with them or comply with their draconian methodology or protocol, they are not really interested. They have always thought of themselves as the benchmark of conservation innovation, and ironically, more recently regard themselves as leaders in the field of combating rhino poaching. The following disparaging words of a good friend, who also happens to be one of the heads of security for Sand Parks, still resound with alarming clarity. Mario, Kruger Park has thrown every conceivable resource at this problem. We have everything except a frigate on the Sabi River at our disposal to combat rhino poaching, and still we are losing at least 3 rhinos a day. 3 rhino per day that the Kruger knows about, I thought to myself. How many more carcasses are out there that they miss and never find? From my limited experience in a comparatively small area, I know how easily fresh carcasses are missed, and indeed how, in less than a week, scavengers can reduce a carcass to virtually nothing but a scattered bone here and there. In the dry season, some carcasses semi-mummify, as they retain much of their shape when the skin dries out stretched over the skeleton. But this is the exception rather than the rule. Within days, you could fly over the scene of a rhino massacre without being any the wiser. We intended to treat the rhino during a relatively quiet time on the reserve, which was to coincide with cooler ambient temperatures. So we chose early autumn, in the week before the Easter holidays. The Hoedspruit Air Force Base Reserve was doing its rhino around the same time, so overall costs could be kept lower. There would also be minimal disturbance to shareholders, as only a few units would be occupied during this period. Unfortunately, as is often the case when dealing with wildlife and the plethora of logistics required to coordinate this kind of operation, it had to be extended by a few days. As it turned out, there were a couple of unforeseeable situations. For example, when emergency surgery was needed in Hammanskraal for a juvenile rhino whose tongue had been severed. This meant veterinarian Charles van Niekerk, who does the horn treatment, couldn't come out until he'd operated on and stabilized a little rhino. Then the Air Force Base couldn't locate a particular rhino, and so on. Eventually, we had no option but to reschedule for the following week, smack bang in the middle of the first busy weekend on Olifants. Back in Hammanskraal, after stabilizing the injured rhino, Charles loaded up his Land Cruiser and drove through the night to Olifants. I met him at Palm Loop Station on the railroad at 1:30 a.m. and took him to my house. I could see he was utterly exhausted. Without much more than a handshake and a cursory good night, he took his overnight bag to the room and climbed into bed. Tomorrow was going to be a big day, and Charles was going to need all the sleep he could get. Assistant vet Sean Beverley, who had arrived earlier, was already fast asleep. Now it was my turn, I thought, snuggling into the cool cotton cover of the pillow. But my mind was racing, filled with trepidation about the huge task and the risks that lay ahead. I agonized about the unknown, every possible scenario that Murphy's Law dictates, and any countermeasures I could prepare for. We'd be conducting a new procedure, and I'd be working with people I didn't know. What were we letting ourselves in for? I didn't sleep a wink. quite literally. Getting up just before 5 a.m., I felt a little like I sometimes do on a New Year's morning. Only this time there was not going to be a lazy sleep-in after a plate of scrambled eggs. This time I'd be in a helicopter at 6 a.m., searching for rhino with a pair of eyes that hadn't been shut for 24 hours. At least Benny would be flying, a comforting thought. Although we could have diverted some of the activity to the fringes of our region in order to minimize any disruption, I'd had another thought. Why not involve as many people as possible, including shareholders, to observe the process? In consultation with Vince Ryan, the Reserve's director in charge of the rhino anti-poaching donations, from which the funding for this operation was derived, we decided it would be good for those people who were on the reserve at the time to see how some of their funds were being used and join in on the experience. It proved to be an excellent idea. An announcement was made over the reserve's radio network that those shareholders who wanted to watch the proceedings were to meet on the airstrip at around 6 a.m. for a briefing. This was to ensure that everyone knew what the procedure entailed and what was to be expected of them as spectators. Well, I'm sure some eager beavers must have camped out all night, or were there before first light, because when I arrived to meet the helicopter, the airstrip was already abuzz with members sipping coffee and dunking rusks. The atmosphere was electric with enthusiasm and expectation. I could go into so much more detail here, but suffice it to say, as it turned out, my apprehension was for naught. Everything went smoothly, and soon everyone was standing around watching as the treatment was applied to the first rhino's horns, microchips inserted, and one of its ears notched. All the while, during the 40-minute procedure, the rhino was monitored by 2 veterinarians, a comforting protocol, as this is a relatively long time for an animal to be tranquilized, and naturally all possible risks needed to be minimized. Given the complexity of such an operation, I would have been happy with 3 or 4 rhino getting done that morning. However, again and again, the coordinated efforts of the team had everyone gaping in awe, as Benny's expert flying and the professionalism of the capture team and veterinarians gelled, culminating in 5 rhino being treated, marked, and released by the time the ambient temperature had begun to climb. By 9 the following morning, the last rhino had been done. The entire operation from start to finish was a success, one of those high-five moments to be shared with all who were there. We had treated 20 rhino, plus another 1 in a neighbouring region. Most of the infusions were attended by busloads of local schoolchildren, as well as staff members from the neighbouring reserves. Signboards were posted along the fences of the reserve and at all the entrance gates, warning of the poisoned horns. Stifling and negative bureaucracy in the national parks could not contemplate this treatment without routine, time-consuming and conclusive testing. As a result, bound by their peers and protocol, not to mention that it was not their innovative idea, certain ecologists in the Kruger did not give the concept a chance, nor do they allow for any research into furthering the efficacy of the concept. Had Natal Parks Board rangers followed the same protocol back in the 1960s, there would have been no problem today. The Kruger wouldn't have had the white rhino that was saved from extinction by being brought up from Natal using the untried, risky, but innovative M99. Why, I asked, with real tears in my eyes, could these narrow-minded egotists not look at the woods rather than focusing on the bloody trees? Next, a popular television program, famous for exposing criminal activity and corruption every Sunday evening, broadcast a one-sided investigative exposé, which promoted the interests of sandparks and horn stockpile holders, cynically undermining RRP's efforts and those of the reserves that had put their hearts into devaluing the market for rhino horn. Naturally, this message would also have reached all the rhino poachers, whether by word of mouth or beamed to those now rich enough from the proceeds of poaching to watch the program in their lavish homes, from Masingia and Maputo to Beijing, Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh City. There can be no doubt that rhino poachers would have interpreted from this ill-considered exposé that they could now effectively expand their killing field and target any rhino they pleased. It was business as usual. It showed that Rhino Rescue Project's attempt to dupe the killers and end users had failed, and all confirmed on television by scientists working in the Kruger National Park. No matter the backpedaling attempt a couple of weeks later by the investigative journalist, the damage had been done. And the biggest irony of all, since the program's expose of RRP, the Kruger National Park had lost nearly 2,000 rhino to poaching, known carcasses and counting. Add to this the private reserve losses, and the figure creeps up to nearly 2,500 rhino killed between 2013 and 2016. How sad that investigative journalism and the egos associated with exposing the facts at all costs can take precedence over a vulnerable species' very existence. Ultimately, there can be no doubt that there will be many treated rhino killed, rhino that might otherwise have been passed up because their horns were believed to be contaminated. The concept of RRP's infusion was primarily aimed at spreading the word among the local population, from where the message would reach the poachers and end users that treated horns were contaminated, rendering their mythical healing properties questionable and the horns unfit for consumption. The degree or efficacy of contamination was never the issue. Essentially, it was largely a smoke and mirrors campaign, and those of us desperate to save the rhino from extinction all knew this from the outset. Unfortunately, now the poachers and the end users perpetuating the demand know it too. Most people would have curled up and died after the criticisms and allegations made concerning RRP, but not Clorinda. She is the quintessential example of fortitude and conservation commitment to a specific end goal, to save rhino from going extinct in the wild. And the latest developments look promising indeed. The other day I received an email from her outlining the basics of RRP's ongoing research. For the last 18 months they have been working with a nuclear physicist and oncologist who has helped refine a technique whereby rhino horns are devalued through the introduction of radioactive isotopes, similar to those commonly used in human nuclear medicine. The horns are thus detectable by law enforcement, even inside a fully packed 40-foot container. They have also partnered with a UK-based university and the manufacturer of a DNA product that forms a permanent bond with horn on a cellular level and illuminates under a UV light. With Lorinda's never-say-die attitude, RRP is still committed to achieving what it sets out to do. Technical details and proof of efficacy aside, their concept of rhino horn infusion remains one of the most proactive innovations attempted by anyone to date. Hats off to them for their noble effort. Saba, My Black-Faced Dog, page 275. In The Man with the Black Dog, I paid tribute to Shiloh, the canine love of my life. A man will have one dog in his lifetime, only one he will share that special bond with, I wrote. Although this was a number of years ago, I still mean every word of it, though I must admit that it owes something to a linguistic sleight of hand. The new dog in my life is not a dog, as Shiloh was, but is in fact a dam, the polite description of a breeding Belgian Malinois female. Her name is Saba. Okay, I love her just as much. There, I said it. Saba, it has to be said, came into my life some 18 years late. Had I known all those years ago what I do now, I would have been less accepting of a life in the bushveld devoid of canine companionship. Nearly 2 decades had passed since I'd buried Shiloh, during which time I'd simply moved on without challenging company policy, even though I was probably the only game ranger in Africa who was not allowed to own a dog. But it was stipulated clearly in my contract. After Shiloh, no dogs allowed. So my life went on without a dog, and I busied myself with building the reserve. There was a lot to do. My children grew up without the pleasure of being around dogs, and instead made do with inconsistent but exciting interactions with wildlife. Being weekly boarders, they had limited time at home on weekends, which was usually spent grinding through heavy homework loads anyway, so it was never a priority to have a weekend dog. Looking back, I have no regrets on that score. However, the changing priorities of nature conservation prompted an about turn in the directors' attitude towards dogs on the reserve. The escalation in rhino poaching was an ideal opportunity to revisit the dog ownership issue and rescind a rather draconian policy. Whatever ulterior motives lay behind the decision, I grabbed the opportunity with both hands. I knew that my choice of a dog hinged on a quid pro quo. There was a modicum of obligation, a certain degree of expectation. Sure, I could have a dog, but I was under no illusion. It could not be any random breed. It should at least be seen to be a deterrent to rhino poachers. Hardly the job for a Yorkie or a Maltese poodle. Suddenly, from nothing for all these years, it was all in front of me now. Not only could I get a dog, but I could get 2 or 3 dogs if I wished. I felt like a starving child let loose in a candy store. I didn't know which to choose. The only thing I knew from the start was that I would only be getting 1 dog. As exciting as this was, I knew this man-dog relationship also needed to meet certain criteria for me personally. I knew it was not a relationship to be entered into lightly. I'd owned and loved a dog before. I had a pretty good idea of what lay ahead of me, and at 57 years of age, I was also well aware of my limitations. Was I up to the task? I was keenly aware of my responsibility to meet the committee's expectations. However, first and foremost, the choice of dog would be my decision. This would go beyond simply acquiring and owning a pet. Once I'd picked a dog, it would be my life for the next 12 to 14 years. I had to be sure. Importantly, I also knew it would not be a purely dog-handler working relationship. I was determined to break the mold and prove that a dog can be just as effective when coaxed off a comfy couch into action as one that is loaded into a crate from the concrete floor of a kennel and deployed to task. I knew this could be done. I was clear from the outset that if acquiring an anti-poaching dog meant keeping it at arm's length to be treated and cared for purely as a working dog, as a living tool, then there was no question. I'd rather not have a dog at all. I'd rather make use of professional canine units as and when we needed. Primarily, I needed a dog that would be able to cope physically with the challenges of living in the hot bushveld. Some breeds of dogs are more tolerant of the heat than others, but these variances are so minimal that it would be safe to say that those breeds favoured as trailing dogs will invariably be heat intolerant. I researched what I thought would be suitable breeds. I spoke to many trainers, breeders and owners, read extensively, and of course visited Dr. Google, and sought the sage advice of Dr. Slung Filyoen, among others.
Track 39.
Eventually, I'd narrowed the search down to 4 breeds. Then I managed to eliminate two close contenders, namely the Rhodesian Ridgeback and German short-haired pointer. The Ridgeback was too big for me to handle. I needed a dog I could pick up easily at my age. The pointer, although the ideal size, was ruled out as I was warned that gun dogs may pose a problem and require firm training to keep them off game scent. I had now narrowed the choice down to two breeds, and even further down to two reputable breeders. It was going to be either an Africanus from Edith and Johann Gallant, which they would source from rural Zululand, or a Belgian Malinois from Antwerpen kennels near Johannesburg. The Africanus has evolved from a long line of sighthounds, dogs that were used on the savannah and deserts of Africa to work in small packs and run down quarry for their masters. Although their noses are as good as that of any medium-sized dog, it is their keen eyesight and ability to focus on the quarry that comes to the fore in this breed. Speed and stamina are what make the Africanus stand out as a hunting dog. However, I needed an all-rounder. Essentially, I was looking for an intelligent dog with a maintenance-free coat and a good trailing nose. Being a good hunter was of secondary importance. Initially, my inclination was towards the Africanus, as this is an all-African dog, a hardy strain which through natural selection has become well adapted to this continent's people, climate, and parasites. Importantly, they are also lightly built, gregarious, highly intelligent, and loyal to the extreme, everything one could wish for in a bush dog. However, in the end it all came down to timing and scent-trailing ability. The latter attribute needed more thought and was of more importance when considering my specific requirements on the anti-poaching front. It is interesting to note that the much-revered lion dog, or Rhodesian Ridgeback, was originally bred from Africanus lions. The second breed I researched in depth was the Belgian Malinois, pronounced Malinois. The history of this dog goes back to 1891, when Belgian veterinarian Adolf Reul established the strain. In 1900, the Belgian Shepherd was recognized by the Société Royale Saint-Hubert as one breed with 4 varieties, namely the Malinois, Groenendael, Lijkenrois, and Tervuren. Belgian Shepherds are extremely versatile dogs, and the Malinois, named after its city of origin, Malines, was originally used as a herding, scout, border patrol, and Red Cross dog. As far as the American Kennel Club was concerned, from 1950 to 1965, there was still uncertainty as to what the Malinois' classification would be, and then in 1965 it gained full recognition as a separate working breed. I believe it was only officially brought into South Africa as late as 1978. To simply say Belgian Shepherd is misleading, as although they share the same general attributes, it is remarkable how different from each other they are in outward appearance. However, of the 4 varieties, I suspect it was primarily the much shorter coat of the Malinois that proved most practical for working in warmer climes, and which has made them more suited to Africa. For me, this was of preeminent importance. The other incredible traits intrinsic in this breed simply made the choice that much easier. I'd first heard of the Belgian Malinois from a Belgian-born neighbour by the name of Stefan van den Boer, who owned a property in Balule. We met at the train bridge shortly after my field rangers had their first firefight with rhino poachers. Naturally, we began to talk of additional means and tactics to combat poaching, and the subject of dogs came up. He mentioned a breed of dog that the US and UN military forces were using in the Middle East with a good measure of success. My ears pricked up instantly. A breed that could work in hot desert environments? Well, now, I thought that is very interesting. Although he told me the name, I could never remember the correct pronunciation, and it soon faded from my memory, as did any thoughts of motivating my committee to allow for me to have a dog at the time. There was no further prompting to jog my memory. No one else around spoke about dogs, and nobody I knew used dogs specifically for rhino anti-poaching work in the Lowveld at the time. However, I do recall an occasion a few months later when Stefan was invited to attend one of our warden's security meetings, and he asked me if he could bring his dog along with him. Reluctantly, I had to inform him of our committee's policy regarding dogs. He obliged and left it at home. In hindsight, a short-sighted decision, one that I possibly could have waived on that occasion. A year later, I was in Gerrit's surgery in Palaborwa, shooting the breeze and mostly talking about fishing in Mozambique. He'd just completed spaying a beautiful tabby cat, but not before showing me how delicately intricate this operation was. We wandered off the subject of fishing momentarily and got into chatting about working dogs, and Gerrit mentioned a dog that had recently chased a snare poacher to the banks of the Groot Letaba River. The poacher dived into the river and began swimming across, confident he'd get away. Without hesitation or encouragement, the dog jumped in and swam after him. The man was caught as he clambered out the other side, where the dog held him until he could be arrested. It was Stefan's Malinois. Fast forward 4 years. Having weighed up everything, I finally made up my mind. The deal was sealed, and I was comfortable with my decision. When Belgian-born breeder Agnes Giroflier heard what I needed the dog for, she placed my name at the top of her long waiting list for puppies. Even then, before Malinois were sought after as anti-poaching dogs, they were a relatively new breed in this country, and with only a few registered breeders at the time, good puppies were difficult to source, so I was humbled by her commitment to the greater cause. Another deciding factor was that Antwerpen's Malinois pups would be born 12 weeks ahead of a litter of Afrikaner pups that Edith had lined up for me in rural KwaZulu-Natal, so the timing went against the African dogs. I admit having had sleepless nights, wondering if I was simply being impatient. Did the urgency of the escalating rhino poaching crisis lead me to choose the Malinois? Or was this kismet? Only time would tell as I began to count the sleeps before my pup could be collected. I had no idea of what lay in store for me, but Edith enlightened me a little in advance. She understood the reasons for my change of heart and was an absolute honey about my decision to opt for the Malinois. Having bred them in the past, she knew the breed well, but she did have this to say to me: "Mario, Malinois will do the job you require, but they will drive you crazy." Needless to say, Edith's words still ring true, but for all the right reasons. I visited Saba's parents a month before her birth, and despite the Malinois' reputation for being aloof and distant, I found these to be a couple of affectionate and energetic dogs. They appeared to be profoundly alert, with a sense of duty to protect on a level I had not seen in other dogs before. I could see from their temperament and demeanour that this breed thrives on work. A Malinois would not be happy on your lap all day. They need a purpose in life. I fell in love with these up-eared dogs immediately. Without so much as a whimper, Saba was taken from her siblings and brought home with us. And at the tender age of 8 weeks, her training began. With the help of professional trainer Jonathan Swartz, we began with the baby steps of trailing, which quickly stimulated her inherent skill. Jonathan spent a few days teaching me how to train Saba, then left me with a comprehensive homework sheet to follow. Primarily, Sabre was trained in trailing human scent in order to assist our anti-poaching rangers to track down elusive rhino poachers, a far cry from what Malinois were originally bred to do, which was to herd and protect sheep in northern Europe. Later, as these herding dogs stole the hearts of their owners, they were bred to protect man and his property, becoming a popular choice as military and police dogs, and latterly as anti-poaching dogs. I now know why. As each day passes and another anti-poaching canine gets that little bit sharper, stories of their successful contribution in this war reach and touch us all. And Sabre is right up there with the best. A growing number of reserves are now using dogs to assist their anti-poaching units in the fight against rhino poaching. Although a number of other breeds are being used with success, the Belgian Malinois is rapidly gaining popularity as the breed of choice. Many are being trained primarily as trailing and attack dogs, where ideally a minimum of 3 dogs need to be deployed. Without exception, all the dogs in this type of deployment need to wear GPS tracking collars, as no one will ever keep up with them once they are released. I know of one section ranger in the Kruger National Park who has needed to use a helicopter to keep pace with his pack. If all goes well, both the dogs and the poachers will be located at the same point. Invariably, the only place safe for poachers being hounded by a pack of Malinois would be up a tree. Belgian Malinois do not make ideal pets. Besides being highly intelligent and athletic, the latter being particularly important in our bushveld heat, they are instinctively guard dogs, protectors and herders by nature. Attacking any threat would come naturally to them, so needless to say, being trained specifically to capture and attack rhino killers would be a huge incentive for them. However, keeping this breed focused on the scent trail and tempering their impatience would be where the all-important training and discipline comes in. The Belgian Malinois wants to work. Physically and mentally, they need regular exercise and stimulation. Some may even require professional training to realize their full potential. And all Malinois need to have an assertive pack leader. Depending on the light, a typical day in Sabre's life starts around 4:30 a.m., a little later in winter. Of course, she sleeps in the house on her couch. Where else? After a quick check with a flashlight that there are no hippo or other creatures patrolling the lawn, she is taken outside to answer the call of nature. This routine is closely followed by a small bowl of watered-down milk, a token amount which is lapped up in seconds, while Megan and I attempt to drink our first cup of coffee. However, in order to keep up with Sabre's demands of imminent duty, this ritual has been reduced to a caffeine infusion. No longer am I able to savour my favourite blend of Arabica, while birdsong and the distant roar of a lion herald the beginning of another day in the bush. Instead, I gulp my coffee down while being subjected to an increasingly persistent wet-nosed nudge against my bare legs, accompanied by the squeak-squeak of those irritating rubber balls. I now drill the whistle out as they are taken from the package. Like their distant cousins, the Border Collie and Australian Kelpie, Malinois need regular exercise and constant stimulation. Before feedlots and paddocks, this would have come from running flat out for hours, herding obstinate sheep in open country. But as these woolly targets are in short supply in the Lowveld, we've had to improvise with fast ground-rolling frisbees and rubber balls. The latter recently limited because chewing on the balls wears down her teeth. Her comfy, chewy-strewn bed and couch now all but forgotten, her tail wagging and her pink tongue lolling, Sabre is now ready for the day, full of unremitting pent-up energy. Tired rarely happens, and exhausted is not in the Malinois vocabulary. Needless to say, most of the ball play and frisbee throwing that Megan and I do at the time is in dressing gown and slippers and underpants and unlaced boots, respectively. We are simply given no time to get dressed. What a sight we must make! Thank goodness this is not suburbia, and the only spectators are our resident Natal spurfowl or the occasional bemused Inyala on the other side of the fence. The red-headed weavers, with their untidiest of all weavers' nests under the eaves near the back door, have seen this all before, and go about the duties of parenthood with the same lack of interest as do the tawny-flanked prinias nesting in the shrubbery next to the carport. Although perfectly suited to many occupations as a versatile working dog, Saba will not be employed to herd sheep, or sniff for contraband and narcotics, nor will she be trained as an attack dog for use in law enforcement canine unit or by the military. Her work will focus primarily on trailing the scent of people. More specifically, she has been trained to assist our field rangers and trackers in those rare circumstances when hot tracks are lost or when in hot pursuit. Her nose will pick up invisible trails, those covering rocky terrain, for example, where the best eye fails and footfalls can only be followed by keen scenting. This is probably one of the most difficult tasks one can expect of a dog. Even the best of bloodhounds are known to lose a trail more often than not. No dog can be expected to perform with infallible consistency and reliability. There are simply too many variables at play. Nevertheless, this is the one task to which most of our canine friends are naturally best suited, and one that no machine can emulate. High ambient temperatures have a limiting effect on working a trailing dog. The hotter it is, and the longer your dog has to work, the less efficient it will become. This means that training is always best done in the early morning or late afternoon. With my routine as it is, late afternoons seem to work best. Initially, I'd go out every day, but as Saba matured, the sessions were reduced in frequency. I would usually prepare a new trail on my own, but on occasion, to change the scent, I would use one of the staff or contract labourers as a trail layer. The trail would then be given time to age. Depending on ambient temperature and humidity, this could vary from 10 minutes to an hour. Location, time of day, and distance of trail were varied whenever practical, to cover as many as possible of the various situations, felt types, and terrain she would be required to work in when she was needed to trail the scent of a poacher. When she senses the routine, Saba eagerly awaits my return. She is then harnessed and given a certain command unique to the task, one that it will remain constant throughout her life and is used when I need her to trail the real thing. When the harness goes on, she already knows what's coming, and her whole demeanour changes. Incredibly, even at the tender age of 16 weeks, her drive was such that if I did not use a chest harness, padded at the front throat area with 10mm felt to make it more comfortable, she would choke on her collar.
Track 40.
As much as I would have liked to temper Saba's extreme drive, I always thought it was better to give her her lead rather than restrict her too much. This is one time when the nose knows. So I followed this awesome miracle of nature at a run, puffing and panting as I was dragged through the bush on the end of a 10-metre leash. As much as I was overjoyed when she tracked a flawless trail, I also loved it when she lost the scent momentarily in her impatience to anticipate, as is the way of the Malinois. When the scent was lost, she would stop abruptly, drop her nose to the ground, and backtrack a little way, Then, momentarily running side to side, she would range until the scent trail was picked up once more, and then she would hurtle off again. Fantastic. Having started at just over 8 weeks of age, Saba underwent progressive training until it reached a point when, at a little over 3 months old, she was tracking trails of more than 500 meters. There appeared to be no end to her drive. It seemed like she could go much further and wanted to go further. I was half inclined to worry that she might burn herself out. I nevertheless decided it was time to consult another expert trailing dog trainer, Warwick Ragg. Sadly, since writing this piece, Warwick has passed away. He understood the Malinois impatience and determination like few others did. So I was grateful for his time and advice. Warwick suggested I cut right back and slow down, not only from the physical aspect, but more because the methodology, the why, needed to be understood by the dog. Then, as a parting shot, he reminded me of something I suspect both Saba and I were becoming oblivious to in our enthusiasm and sheer enjoyment of working together. He reminded me that although Saba had the incredible drive and determination typical of the Malinois, I would need to be the adult, take charge, and rein her in a little. After all, she was still a baby. Although Saba had become everyone's overzealous friend, it is not by chance. Since a puppy, her social skills were emphasized, and any sign of aggression, even in play, was discouraged. I knew from the outset that Saba would never be used as both a trailing and attack dog. She would be taught to focus on trailing human scent only, and at the point of locating poachers, or in very close proximity to them, encouraged to bark and not attack. To have physical contact with poachers would be to risk injury or worse. Therefore, as a backup method of control, Saba would always be joined to me by that 10-meter leather tracking line. At a little over a year old, her trailing had progressed in close parallel with her blossoming into maturity, which manifested itself in increasingly measured and decidedly deliberate behavior. I believed she now knew exactly what was expected of her, and that the balance between working dog and loving companion had been achieved. However, this kind of relationship does not suit all situations and requirements. Saba could ride the bicycle. Now all she needed was to enter a race and hopefully get to wear the maillot jaune. But even champions have to train hard, and at 5 months old she would find herself trailing the real thing. You may recall when I wrote about the first black rhino poached on olifants and how we were close behind the poachers. Their tracks were so fresh, in fact, that some of the grass bent by their feet was springing back up as the rising sun drank the dew. Although we already had some of the best men ready to take up and follow the poachers' tracks, I thought this would also be a good opportunity to bring Saba in behind the trackers for a training exercise. So I radioed Megan and asked that she bring her to the airfield. This would take at least 30 minutes, and I couldn't allow the trackers to waste even a moment, so they began on the spoor immediately while I waited. I knew the poachers' tracks would now be contaminated with the scent of the trackers. Nevertheless, I thought this would be excellent practice for Saba. The thought, preposterous as it was, did cross my mind. Imagine a 5-month-old dog tracking down armed poachers at her first attempt. Wow! Needless to say, Saba had no such delusions of grandeur, just a drive and focus typical of the breed. Fearlessly, and like a seasoned professional, she took to the tracks immediately, with as much enthusiasm as she had done since she was 8 weeks old. Despite an inordinate amount of zigzagging, Saba located the field rangers and trackers within minutes. What had taken 3 men more than 30 minutes to accomplish, she had done in 2. That was more than good enough for me. It was fantastic. This was the longest natural trail Saba had followed to date, about 900 meters, with all the false trails. A little while later, after checking the Palm Loop River bed for any tracks crossing the soft sand and finding none, I proudly led my happy pup back to the vehicle. After a good drink of water, Saba went home with Megan, while I returned to the carcass and the autopsy team. The reason for the unusual zigzag line created by the tracking team, which Saba trailed as they walked it, was that they too were coursing, checking each game trail in an effort to locate the poacher's spoor. Crafty as always, the bastards were doing everything they could to throw us off the track. But Saba was not easily fooled. She had led us to the railway line, and at least we now had a rough idea of which direction the poachers were taking. We later determined that the poachers had climbed onto the railway track close by and used it in the same way that escaped felons pursued by dogs are known to use a stream or river. This anti-tracking measure slowed us down considerably. I then got prepared to face the practicality of the desperate situation that now confronted the Baluli regional wardens and field rangers. It was as though there was a haystack right in front of us with 2 needles, moving through a relatively narrow area of the stack. All we had to try and do was anticipate where they were most likely to emerge and when. My elation with Saba's ability may have been a little premature. I needed to return to the reality that she was only a puppy. This was as far as she would go for now. A Tale of Pluck and Peril, page 287. I can understand why the pioneer hunters never visited the Lowveld in the wet season. If malaria and Nagana didn't kill you and your livestock respectively, then there'd be a host of other creatures determined to find their way into your boots or your bed as routinely as if it was part of their natural life cycle. To this day, summertime in Africa's big game country is not for barefoot children or the ungloved hand. Nor is it the ideal place for domestic dogs. I'm always a little on edge at this time of the year when I am out with Saba. At night, the big cats rule. A dog that wanders from its master or too far from the fireside will be taken by a leopard as quickly as a fox takes a rabbit. A brave dog will have its skull crushed by a lion before it can utter a scream, and a curious one will have its eyes spat in by a Mozambique spitting cobra before its first birthday. Ratters that don't listen and constantly nose around for rodents in hollow logs and under rocks will be killed by a venomous snake sooner or later. Overprotective dogs will meet their nemesis when they square up to baboons which have canines longer than a lion's. Nowhere is safe in the true sense of the word, and even taking your dog onto the lawn of your home at night can be a perilous excursion. Saba was less than 5 months old, and Megan had just taken her out to have a last whittle before bed. On the way back to the house, less than a couple of meters from our back door, Saba uttered a howling scream so loud and relentless that my knees went wobbly. I rushed out to find Megan holding Saba and looking at her foot with a flashlight. Initially I thought my puppy may have stepped awkwardly and injured her leg, but a quick examination revealed nothing obvious. It could only be one of 2 things, I thought, a puff adder or a scorpion. Taking a flashlight, I traced the route to and from the spot where Saba had relieved herself, and noticed something small and black, about as thick as a pencil, sticking out of the grass. Closer examination revealed it was the business end of a thick-tailed scorpion, Parabuthus transvalicus, but it was motionless. Saba must have stood on it, crushing the creature to death, but not before it reflexively delivered some of the most potent scorpion venom in the world into her little body. At that time there was no antivenom serum for scorpion stings. The pain, particularly from a thick-tailed scorpion sting, is indescribable, and nothing is known to block the pain receptors. In the past, the best treatment for humans involved immersing the site in the hottest water bearable. This apparently helps by breaking down and partially cooking the protein in the venom cocktail that is responsible for the pain. But how was I going to get my little pup to understand that the pain of the near-boiling water was for the best and would be short-lived? Instead, I telephoned Gerrit's colleague, Dr. Sampi Ras, who advised me to give Saba a Valium and then bring her to the clinic as soon as possible. Travelling through Olifants North, a journey of well over an hour, is still the shortest route by road to Palaborva. Being late at night, this was an unusual time to exit, so I explained the situation to the gate guard, who then tried to lean into the window to look at Saba out of curiosity and offer sympathy. Instead of a whimpering puppy, he was met with a defensive growl. Well, I thought, that's a good sign. Saba is still alert and on guard, so she can't be dying. At the clinic, Sampi took charge and immediately tranquilized Saba. While she was still groggy and the pain easing as part of the treatment, he injected a huge subcutaneous dose of calcium into her shoulder area. He explained that as there was no known pain blocker, he would keep her in a semi-tranquilized state until her body had dissipated much of the venom, which usually took a day or so. It was the only thing to do to relieve the pain. Once Saba was comfortable and out of conscious pain, Sampi showed me two of his other patients that had been stung by the same species of scorpion and were busy recovering. The little Maltese poodle appeared to be in better shape than the much larger Ridgeback cross. At that time of the year, Sampi dealt with up to 3 dogs a day stung by scorpions. And as the thick-tailed scorpion is a nocturnal species, all the serious incidents occurred at night, mostly on summer nights, and more often than not, after a thunderstorm. I gave Sampi the bottle of 2008 Baxberg Merlot that Megan had conjured up as I left home. How the hell does she think of these things at a time like this, I wondered. Anyway, I thanked the good doctor once again and wished him a good morning. It was already way past midnight, and I needed to get back. After a sleepless few hours filled with trepidation, I phoned Sampi at around 8 a.m. as he'd suggested. Maybe it was a little earlier than he said, but what the heck? Waving my apology aside, he told me Saba had responded well. She had eaten, which was a very good sign, and although she was still in a little pain, I could come and collect her that afternoon around 2 p.m. A typical symptom of a dog recovering from a scorpion sting is a gagging cough, repeated a few times a day, as if they are trying to bring up bile but don't have any to expel, he explained. Apparently this can last for up to a week, and the best part of this reaction is that it's a good sign. It means all is okay. A couple of months later, Saba had completely recovered. The calcium lump on her shoulder, which had been the size of a cuttlefish bone, had been completely absorbed by her system. She was now nearly 7 months old, and I needed to take her into the clinic for routine jabs. Afterwards, when I let Saba out on the lawn to sniff and investigate all the strange smells outside the clinic, a beaming Sampi took me around to his surgery, where he opened his dispensary and proudly thrust a small vial into my hand. "This is scorpion antivenom, from the first batch ever produced," he said. He had ordered more, but at a cost of nearly 2,000 rand per vial, he couldn't keep too much in stock. Cheap at the price, I thought, as I remembered Saba's agony. I would have paid any price for the antivenom had it been available at the time. What a relief to know that it was now available. I commissioned a vial to be on perpetual standby. But this was not the end of the scorpion saga, not by a long shot. I had more anguish to endure. Venom was about to be unleashed into my ear for which there is no known antivenom. A couple of days after the incident, my telephone rang. Agnes Girafleia, Saba's breeder, had heard of Saba's ordeal. Expecting a polite inquiry about Saba's recovery and some words of commiseration for my pain and suffering, instead I was subjected to a tirade of patronizing advice. "Haven't you heard of ultraviolet scorpion flashlights?" she spat. "You of all people should know about them. Now go and buy a few. Then make sure there are no scorpions around to sting my baby again." Well, I guess that message sank right in. I now have 5 ultraviolet scorpion torches, 1 for each room and 2 spares. About 4 months later, in the early autumn, we had another close encounter. It was late afternoon, and shadows were lengthening as the autumn sun sank lower on the horizon. The incessant zizz of 1 billion cicadas began to fade as they handed the baton to coveys of crested spurfowl that were signalling the onset of roosting time. Familiar sights and sounds at day's end in the South African bush. And like 100 others that characterized the last summer, it was also hot and dry. Perfect conditions for a quick dip in the pool, I thought, as I called Saba outside to our carport. Before I'd clicked my fingers a second time, she'd already leaped into the back of my Land Cruiser. I drove down the familiar route to the Olifants River floodplain, a road Saba and I take every day to the office. While wending our way down the hill in the early morning, we often come across herds of impala, waterbuck and zebra as they head up into the bushlands after spending the night on the relatively sparse river floodplain. Usually, by mid-morning, things have quietened down, and the sun-baked plains appear relatively desolate until late afternoon, when the animals return there to sleep. Troops of baboons cross the open grassland, heading back to roost in the safety of the huge ebony and boerbean trees that line the banks of the Olifants River. Glancing in the rear-view mirror, I could see Saba panting, and though her spoon-shaped tongue was doing a good job of regulating her body temperature, the excited wag in her tail told me she was anticipating a much more enjoyable way of cooling down. There was no surprising Saba. No amount of subtle suggestion or hidden hint could fool her. She knew exactly where we were headed. But I would try not to hype her up unduly, as this could lead to disappointment when on occasion the pool was occupied by shareholders and we'd need to give it a miss. At least then she'd have a mini game viewing drive, going there and heading back home again. Saba always showed a keen interest in the game we drove past, particularly the herds of impala, which must have triggered some latent sheep-herding instinct in her. Though less woolly and a lot more agile, these were nevertheless flighty herd animals.
Track 41.
Having recently embarked on some routine thatch maintenance on a small cottage near the pool area, I thought I'd check on progress and give Saba a quick dip at the same time. She loves swimming, and since she was a tiny pup, it has always been a huge treat for her, particularly in a climate where she needs to be able to utilize any available waterhole or wallow in the bush as a cooling aid. Being a Saturday meant that the thatchers would have finished at midday, and hopefully those few shareholders in residence had already headed out on an afternoon game drive. So we'd be disturbing no one and have the pool to ourselves for a while. However, we arrived to find things were not as quiet as we expected. Approaching the parking area, I could see there were baboons on the lawn surrounding the pool. It was clear the lack of activity had also been an open invitation for our resident troop to make use of the facilities. I entered the clubhouse with Saba on a lead, as I knew the sight of these primates so close to home would trigger her prey drive. As usual, the baboons had taken full advantage. They'd completely ignored the clearly marked his and hers WCs and used the poolside paving instead. Needless to say, when they saw us, they dropped a few more calling cards in surprise as they vaulted over the fence and ran down the river bank, barking and screaming. I waited until they were a good distance away before tossing a ball into the pool for Saba to retrieve. Being somewhat distracted cleaning up the baboon poop on the poolside paving, I was caught completely off guard when Saba climbed out, dropped the ball onto the lawn, and made for the fence. Unbeknown to me, a huge baboon, which had hung back until now, had sauntered past in full view on the outside of the fence. The baboon's arrogant swagger and sideways glance was too much for Saba, and she gave chase before I could respond. Even so, I thought the electrified fence would stop her, as it usually did. Ever since inadvertently getting shocked as a puppy, she had been wary of its bite. Unfortunately, the Thatchers had forgotten to turn the power back on when they left for the day. Saba must have sensed this, and went through the strands chasing after the baboon, which was now hell-bent on catching up with the rest of its screaming troop. By the time I had jumped into the vehicle and driven around to the river floodplain some 300 metres away, it was all over. A huge donga blocked the vehicle's way, and despite my state of desperation, I knew this one would be too much, even for the land cruiser. Unable to drive any further, I ground to a halt in a cloud of dust, quickly switched the motor off and climbed out. Other than the cacophony of the baboons fading into the distance, there was not a sound. Dry-mouthed, I called out to Saba, desperately hoping to get a response, while deep down expecting none. Fearing the worst, I unzipped the gun bag and shouldered my rifle. Stooping, I made my way along the floodplain, trying to locate tracks in the fading light. I hadn't gone too far when a movement caught my eye. It was Saba running up a hippo path on the other side of the gully towards me. At a distance, all looked okay. She appeared to be running easily. But as she got closer, I could see blood streaming from a gash on her flank and other smaller wounds near her rear end. Reflexively, I clicked my fingers, and she leapt effortlessly into the back of the land cruiser. But there was blood dripping everywhere. I needed to get her home quickly and stop the bleeding. Trying to get a vet late on a Saturday afternoon in our area is no easy task. The only one who could help me was Gerrit. At my call, he dropped everything and opened his surgery in preparation for Saba. Within an hour and a half, she was on an operating table getting treated by one of the best surgeons in this field, eagerly assisted by yours truly, possibly the worst assistant in the field. But, given the circumstances, I could not possibly have wished for more. Under anaesthesia, and with the aid of the powerful theatre light, a thorough examination of her wounds was done, revealing the full extent of her injuries. Gerrit did the surgery, while I helped him by monitoring Saba's breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. I also made a conscious effort in my apprehensive state not to ask too many stupid questions, but rather let him get on with the nitty-gritty of patching my dog's wounds. Although rather nasty-looking, the deep fang wounds on Saba's rump were largely muscle damage, and according to Gerrit, the prognosis was good. He then lifted Saba's leg and showed me the smaller, not-so-obvious wound inside her groin, which could have killed her. The baboon's canines had only just missed her femoral artery. A close call indeed. Cesare had come within 10 millimeters of bleeding to death on that dusty floodplain that afternoon. She would have been 18 months old. Even as I asked the question, I knew what the answer was going to be. Will she learn from this traumatic event, Gerrit? With a wry smile he turned to me. No, my friend, only you will. Protective dogs and dogs with a high prey drive will always chase baboons. It's in their DNA. In fact, though I would have been reluctant to confess it to Gerrit, Cesare was on the trail of rhino poachers less than 9 days after the incident, her stitches still in situ. Some time later I was watching her as she loped next to my vehicle on the training run we do almost every day. As always, I kept one eye on her and one on the road and adjacent bush. I always marvelled at her pulling power and athleticism, her love for running, and sometimes I'd become a little mesmerized by her motion. Next to me, between the seats, is my rifle. God knows what I carry it for on these runs, but I guess it gives me a measure of assurance, in that I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And so far, touch on wood, I have not needed it. As we rounded a smooth, sandy corner, my peripheral vision caught the briefest glimpse of something unusual in the road. I jerked my head round and glanced dead ahead of the vehicle, and there, in the road, not 50 meters ahead, were 2 huge male lions ambling straight towards us. Cesare hadn't seen them, or was pretending she hadn't. I ground the vehicle to a halt and jumped out in front of the bemused lions. Leaving the door open, I pulled Cesare around to the back of the vehicle, clicked my fingers and gave the command, "Up!" which simply meant, "Jump on the back of the Land Cruiser as quick as you can, my girl, before we both become lion food." To my relief, she did exactly as instructed. With Cesare safely on the back, I then turned to look at the road. The lions were gone, and the rifle was still between the seats. Not that I would have needed it for anything more than a shot in the air, at worst. I am often asked about the possible threat to Cesare from armed poachers. At the risk of seeming flippant, I am beginning to suspect, going on statistics alone, that she is more at risk of getting injured at home. Trust your dog. The nose knows. Page 295. Relentlessly persecuted and driven to the brink of extinction by man, only a fraction of the world's wolves now enjoy protection. These wild ancestors of today's domestic dogs still depend on an acute sense of smell for their continued existence. This is particularly evident in wilderness areas such as Yellowstone National Park in the USA, where wolves have been successfully reintroduced and are doing very well. Well-established packs are living wild, using their noses for finding small food items or carrion, receptive mates, and to form the social bonding necessary to structure effective hunting packs. However, despite their protected status, which is confined to the park boundaries, they are becoming more dependent than ever on having a superb nose for their survival, particularly in the face of another ominous threat to their lives, each time they wander beyond the protected zone. From time to time, pack dynamics can dictate that some wolves may lose their status and get pushed beyond the boundaries of the park, which is surrounded by domestic stock farms. Until they become established or form packs of their own, these individuals often enter private land where they inevitably come across domestic animals. Being apex predators, wolves do not distinguish between wild or domestic prey, and these efficient killers can take a considerable toll on the relatively easy-to-catch farm animals, which naturally brings them into direct conflict with man. Farmers determined to protect their livelihood use every means at their disposal to combat this threat. Subsequently, These nomadic wolves' survival now hinges almost entirely on their olfactory acuity, and many of them have learned to use their noses to detect hidden traps and avoid meat laced with virtually odorless poisons. Alas, even among wolves there will be individuals with better noses than others. So some do fall victim to man's deadly ploys. On the upside, I suspect the survivors will return to breed even sharper-nosed pups. The canine nose is one attribute that has changed very little with domestication. By way of example, surmising a Maltese poodle is about as far from a wolf as one would care to breed, I would wager that their sense of smell is still as keen as a jackal's. An average dog has about 200 million olfactory receptors. A bloodhound has more than 250 million. A Belgian Malinois like Cesare has about 220 million. Humans, by comparison, have 5 million. It's no wonder, then, that dogs' scenting ability is legendary, so much so as to seem unbelievable or even miraculous at times. Little wonder that the skeptics among us often believe the dog is wrong. Saba was 11 months old when Roxanne Brummer of Green Dogs Conservation visited Baluli. Although Rox had scheduled this follow-up visit with the other regional warden's dogs, which she had trained and brought into the area, I too was keen to meet the Barbara Woodhouse of the bush. Having heard so much about her success with dogs, naturally I was keen to observe her training methods at first hand and possibly get some advice on training Saba. It was most encouraging to hear about the efficacy and progress of her anti-poaching dogs deployed in Zimbabwe, Zambia, and even further afield in Africa. What I found particularly fascinating was that some dogs had been trained to detect wire and cable snares. Although I gleaned from the presentation that her training technique differed slightly from what I'd been doing with Saba, the objective remained the same. So when the other dogs had been given a brief lesson and the wardens shown how to continue with their training program, I arranged with Rox for a quick session with Saba. Early the following morning, we drove out to my usual training area, which is not too far from our house. It's a quiet vale comprising raisin bush thickets and sandy game trails with gentle curves rather than sharp corners, ideal terrain for trailing. But today, of all days, a breeding herd of elephant was in the valley. They were feeding peacefully, which meant they could be there a while. I suggested we leave them to their breakfast and move on to the riparian woodland near the Olifants River instead. We stopped at a given point along the road. Roxanne and Regional Warden Frikkie Kotza got out of their vehicle, and, as we'd arranged, from there they would simply wave and walk away from us. After 10 minutes or so, I was to put Saba on their trail. Saba had taken to Rox the moment she met her, so with her tail wagging, my doting puppy watched her new friend disappear from view as the bush closed in behind them. I then let her down of the vehicle and placed her into her trailing harness, waited the agreed 10 minutes, and set her onto their trail. Saba's trail seemed to angle down towards the river, but I had a feeling that Rox and Frikkie would have avoided the water because of hippo and crocodiles. So I gently pulled on the lead, encouraging her to sniff along the trail I thought they would most likely have taken, which ran parallel with the floodplain. Again, after about 50 meters, Saba inclined back towards the river, but with more persistence. This time I let her follow her nose, until I saw she was making straight for some boulders on the river's edge. I knew Saba loved the water, and since it was a warm morning, possibly the prospect of cooling off was attracting her. By my sceptical reckoning, the rocky outcrop, being the only cover on the plain, was too close to the river itself, too exposed, and perhaps too obvious a place to hide away from us. So once again I pulled her away, and once again Saba obliged and ran on the game trail that I encouraged her to, incredibly jumping clean over the carcass of a baby impala, showing absolutely no interest in it at all. Again, after a couple of 100 meters on my trail, she strained on the lead and again inclined back towards the river. Suddenly the light bulb in my stubborn brain lit up. This was too determined, even for a puppy, I thought. But it was too late. Frikkie and Rox were already walking up from the floodplain with that ho-hum look on their faces. They had given up waiting for us, thinking we'd gone in the opposite direction, which we had, and told me they had been there all the time, hidden behind the boulders. In fact, they'd heard me talking to Saba and pulling her away, only meters from where they huddled. If only I had listened to my dog. Strike one. Since an 8-week-old pup, Saba had not known anything other than the warm, dry bushveld of Olifants River Game Reserve. It was where she'd lived and trained. It was the only environment she'd known until 12 months later, when we took her with us on a short holiday to a slice of heaven, high up in the Drakensberg Mountains of KwaZulu-Natal, called Rainbow Lakes. Our hosts, Olifant shareholders Liz Castle and Dr. Neville Howes, were keen to see a trailing dog at work, even though at this stage of Saba's training it was still a huge game for her. Scent trailing was fun. It was exciting and, of course, rewarding. However, this part of the country is wet and cool, essentially a treeless terrain of rolling hills and mist-covered grasslands, the antithesis of her training ground. So, although I was a little apprehensive as to what effect it might have on her scenting, I was keen to see how she worked in cold conditions. Liz and Megan set off into the cold, mist-shrouded hills to lay a trail while Saba, Neville and I lounged in front of the cosy fireplace of the fishing cottage. I'd asked them to leave a tissue on the fence at the end of the paddock to mark the start of their trail. Saba and I would give them a 45-minute head start. Locating the marker and a few trodden blades of grass which were already beginning to straighten, I gave Saba the tissue to sniff, followed by the command, "Soek, soek."
Track 42.
Trailing confidently, she bounded over fresh molehills and field mouse tunnels, dropping her nose only momentarily when the direction of scent changed. Saba appeared to love the cool, damp conditions. I suspect this weather was reminiscent of her bloodline's country of origin. For her ancestors, this was the norm, and true to the nature of this dog, she adapted immediately to the calling. I clung onto the 10-meter leather lead as the mist closed in, reducing visibility to less than 30 meters. After nearly a kilometre of trailing, a lone figure loomed ahead of us. As we got closer, I recognized the cottage's housekeeper, who had taken a short cut and was heading home over the hill. I immediately assumed Saba had mistakenly been trailing her scent, so I exerted control and changed direction. Despite Saba trying to pull me back onto course, we headed back to start the trail from scratch. Again, at the start of the trail, Saba took off, and again in the same direction as earlier. But before I could correct her once more, we came across Megan and Liz walking back towards us. When I told them about the housekeeper and why I'd turned back, they said they'd seen her pass right by them, but because they were well hidden, she'd not seen them. Then as time passed, they'd become concerned that Saba and I might not find them either, and so decided to head back. It was then that I realized my mistake. Saba had been right all along. Had I allowed her to, she would have passed the housekeeper, focusing on the tissue scent, and found Liz and Megan. Although this was embarrassing for me at the time, I once again learned a valuable lesson regarding my working relationship with my dog. Strike 2. From that day on, I trusted Saber's nose, implicitly. Many people confuse tracking with trailing. There are fundamental differences, as I will briefly try and explain. Tracking is following visible signs. Human beings like the San Bushmen, Shangans, and Apache are among the best at this. Trailing is following a scent trail, and here nothing in our context can compete with a good dog. What about truffle-sniffing pigs, I hear you ask? Well, that's another ball game entirely, but I suspect that trailing poachers with a plump porker on a lead is simply not a practical option in the African bush, not to mention the handler's dented ego. We are finding that the early detection of incursions and follow-up hot pursuit operations are key to keeping poachers on the back foot. However, a few do slip through from time to time, and it is at this point that a good trailing dog comes into its own. By assisting our tracker's eyes with her nose, Saber is able to save precious time that would otherwise be wasted when poachers employ anti-tracking techniques that are undetectable to the human eye but can be picked up by a trailing dog. Early one morning, less than a month after Saber bagged her first rhino poacher, our field rangers made contact with 3 poachers who had waded across the river early one morning. When challenged by our rangers, the poachers fled, but in their haste to get away they dropped a small backpack containing a pair of boots, a knife and some food. It was all we had as proof of their existence, as the early dawn light and the thick riparian vegetation simply closed in behind them, and they melted away. It is not often we get a scent article as fresh as a smelly pair of boots, or indeed a sweat-soaked pack, and this was as good as it gets. Unfortunately, in their eagerness to catch the fleeing poachers, much of the trail was contaminated when our rangers gave chase, inadvertently mixing the scent. Despite this, Saber took the trail, leading us through the bush along the floodplain. Then, as if being yanked by an invisible cord, she inexplicably slowed down and angled sharply back towards the river, taking us to the water's edge. Through the reeds I could see a steep drop-off into the deeper sections of the river. As Saber was unaware of the danger from the huge crocodiles that lurk in these pools, I held her back and guided her through to the relatively shallow section instead. Initially I thought she'd wanted to get to the water because she was feeling the heat or needed a drink, or simply because she'd lost interest in the trail and wanted to play in the water. I was wrong on all counts. Trusting Saber, I followed as she led us all along the river bank into another thick reed bed, where once again she tried to get into the water. This time I held her back for fear of crocodiles. However, my faith in her was resolute, so I instructed the rangers to head back upriver, cross the train bridge, and check the bank opposite our position for exit tracks. I must confess this was based on more than a hunch. I knew Saber could detect scent over the span of the Olifants River, but the trust I increasingly placed in her nose was underpinned by an event that had occurred nearly 10 years before, not too far from where we stood now. I recalled the incident as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. At the time, fences were still up between ourselves and the Cesare Nature Reserve, and we were compelled to provide supplementary feed for our rhino and buffalo through the winter months. As it happened back then, I watched as more than 100 buffalo stood on the opposite bank of our reserve. They had waded through to state land on an old, familiar migration route and spent the night in search of grass on the northern perimeter of the region. Finding little, they had returned to the river, where young shoots of low-felt reeds, which grew on the sandy banks, offered some nourishment. Several of the older buffalo were standing in the shallows, seemingly undecided on whether to return to equally poor grazing prospects or to turn around and go further north. a perilous journey into the mining properties and more state-owned land. Who knows what goes on in the mind of an African buffalo? The Olifant River was at least 200 meters wide at that point, and I had no way of enticing them back across. Somehow I needed to convince them of the supplementary feeding on offer on our side. Fortunately, a faint, ever so faint, breeze was drifting across, which gave me an idea. I split one of the lucerne bales I was carrying in the back of my land cruiser. Then, climbing onto the roof of the vehicle, threw pieces of it as high as I could into the air. Most of it fell back to the ground, but some of the finer dust drifted on the wind. It was a long shot, but it was clear from their jittery attitude that the buffalo knew we were there, so they must have picked up our scent. And I surmised that if they could smell us, they would most certainly smell the lucerne. In times like these, hunger overruled caution. The need to eat was greater, and within minutes more than 140 buffalo were in the water, wading across to our side. What a sight it made! Wild African buffalo coming towards me like cattle in a cowboy movie being rustled across the Rio Grande. Though it had been years since they had been fed lucerne through winter, they knew exactly what that dry lucerne dust promised, and somehow communicated this to those too young to know. It was a promise we kept, at the rate of 40 bales per day until the rains came. Less than an hour later, we received confirmation that the poachers had indeed crossed the river directly opposite to where Saba had indicated. I had been spot on in trusting her ability. She could smell where the poachers had climbed out of the water. Her gaze pointed to exactly where they had crossed, something no eye could ever have picked up over the span of the Olifant River. Only an exceptional nose could have done that. At great risk to themselves, the poachers tried to fool us by wading through the deeper section of the river, no doubt thinking we'd be covering the shallower water where incursions and retreats usually took place. However, with Saba having done her job, she had saved our field rangers hours of needless tracking and backtracking. Though the rangers could now easily track the poachers, who had thrown caution to the wind and were running hard, they'd had an adrenaline-fueled head start of 2 hours and were able to reach the main road before we could catch up with them. There, on the side of the road, in the sand, were all the signs, as clear as if a detailed note had been left for us. They indicated that the poachers were picked up by an accomplice's vehicle. However, this time it was on empty stomachs and empty-handed. Having reiterated that one of a dog handler's greatest failings when trailing scent is to not trust your dog's nose, it is also true that a relationship can develop between a handler and their dog that is so close they can read each other's body language. In such an enviably close relationship, a dog can be pulled and assisted to get back on the trail it has lost temporarily, particularly one that you've been able to verify by visual means, or indeed if information allows you to leapfrog, thereby saving precious time and getting the dog onto a fresher scent. In certain circumstances, a combination of dogs can be used to maximum effect, particularly in rounding off a scenting dog's efforts. Ideally, trailing dogs, such as a pack of American foxhounds, are released on the fresh scent trail. The pack is then followed by a helicopter to keep pace. On board are at least 3 fresh attack dogs, such as Belgian Malinois and Dutch Shepherds. These dogs are a popular choice for finishing things off, because although both breeds are excellent trailing dogs, they are super athletes and can be extremely effective attack dogs as well. When the foxhounds locate the rhino poachers, the attack dogs are then released to help rangers secure an arrest. Nobody can hide or get away from a pack of Malinois. In conversation with Richard Cesare, one of the senior rangers in the Kruger National Park, I was pleased to hear that dogs are being used more and more to track and apprehend rhino poachers. Richard is undoubtedly the most experienced ranger on the ground in the war against rhino poaching in the Kruger. He was also one of the first rangers to recognize the efficacy of using packs of dogs. His commitment and his success with canines have led to an exciting development in this regard. Overseas interest and funding have assisted this project in getting off the ground in a big way. In fact, so much progress has been made that a large canine academy has been built at the Wildlife College near the Kruger Park's open gate. I told Richard that if I were a younger man, the challenge of training and working with dogs of the caliber they have at the centre is something I would have loved to become involved with. Talking of dog-loving game rangers, this chapter would be incomplete without a brief mention of Craig Spencer's Malinois Shire. This well-trained sniffer dog was given to him by the Wildlife and Environment Society of South Africa, WESA. A valuable donation indeed, as a professionally trained Malinois can fetch upwards of 200,000 rand. Not quite within the range of a game ranger's accessories budget. Needless to say, this was the least of Craig's reasons for becoming terminally besotted with his handsome new dog. A year or so before acquiring Saba, I met Shire for the first time one dark, humid night. As it happened, Craig and two of his student rhino monitors were parked at one of our larger waterholes on Olifants, investigating a static signal from one of the GPS rhino collars. This signal either meant the wearer was dead or had thrown the collar, or that there was a technical hitch. In any event, we all needed to determine the reason, one way or the other. Craig and I stood there in the dark, chatting quietly, while some calculations were being made to determine the direction and distance of the signal. All the while, Shire lay quietly on the back seat of Craig's Land Rover. Craig explained that Shire was specifically trained to detect contraband, such as drugs, but now the focus of his training had been shifted to detect bullets, spent casings, ivory and rhino horn at roadblocks, airports and border posts. This was intriguing for me, as at that stage I had no idea of the differences between sniffer dogs, trailing dogs and tracking dogs. "Let him out, Craig," I said. "Oh, no shit, Mario, I can't, he bites." "Relax," I said. "I'll stand next to my vehicle, and if it looks like he wants to eat me, I'll jump in." With that, Craig opened the door and let Shire out. It was really dark, so I was unable to get any warning. I could see no expression or sign of aggression, just his wagging tail and total devotion to Craig as he lay down next to him with a single command, "Platz." "Watch this," Craig said, now a little more relaxed since Shire had not shown any interest in taking a chunk out of me. Taking charge, he put Shire into work mode immediately and asked me to stand away from my vehicle but leave the door wide open. Using the same command I now use for Saba to take a trail, "Soek, soek," Craig showed Shire my vehicle. He then pointed to the area of the chassis between the front and back wheels. Strange place to direct a dog, I thought. I was sceptical, to say the least, and expected this to go badly. First, because whenever you want to show someone how well your dog performs, something unforeseen will cause the trained pooch to become distracted and not quite step up to the plate. And second, because I had shot a couple of impala that morning for staff rations and knew that despite thoroughly washing the blood out of the back, there would always be a vestige stuck away in some crevice missed by the scrubbing brush. I assumed Shire would focus on that, or indeed be distracted by the 2 dog pellets caught between the running board and door jamb that I'd accidentally dropped when feeding the mangy jackal that day. Shire sniffed the chassis under the vehicle, went past the bloody smells of the tailgate with only a cursory sniff, then around to the driver's side, where I was sure the pellets would stop him. He stood up on the running board and craned his neck into the cab, his chest directly over the 2 dog pellets. His tail wagged and he spoke. Craig pulled him back, and we both peered in to see what he'd picked up and barked at. I was absolutely dumbstruck. It was the 2 spent .223 cartridge casings from the bullets I'd used to shoot the impala that day, and which I'd dropped in the footwell. All caution to the wind, I immediately stroked and patted this incredible dog. Being bitten by such an intelligent animal would have been a privilege. Scars to show my grandkids? Alas, to this day, Shire has never bitten me. Malinois are canine athletes. They don't know what it is to slow down or take it easy. Everything is done at a frenetic pace. Even in play, they give it their all. Only a month after our meeting, Craig phoned to tell me that Shire had injured himself in a tragic accident. He lost his footing at full speed playing near a dam in the Timbavati Nature Reserve, where he slipped and fell onto jagged rocks. The bones in his front left leg were smashed beyond repair. Craig was given 2 options: to have Shire humanely put down, or to have the leg amputated and keep his dog with only 3 legs. Without hesitation, he opted for the latter. Craig's decision to keep Shire gained him my deep respect as a person. And though, as he rightly claims, Shire is essentially a sniffer dog, and so will not need all his legs to do the job he was trained for, I know this rationale was way down Craig's list for keeping his beloved dog. Saba's next call to duty led us to a familiar spot on the southern bank of the Olifants River. Recent weeks had seen a spate of incursions by 3 poachers whose presence on the reserve was only ever confirmed when our field rangers came across their tracks crossing the river, heading out. On one occasion, with their ghastly mission accomplished, they'd carried the horns of a poached rhino to the river bank at around midnight. Throwing all caution to the wind, they set the backpack containing the horns down in the soft sand.
Track 43.
Still warm, the sinus passage tissue hacked off along with the horn bled through, pooling in the indentation left behind. Then the killers calmly took off their shoes, shouldered the backpack, their axe and the rifle, waded into the river, and exited the reserve. Arrogantly, as if in mocking defiance, and spiked with the euphoria of success, they did not bother to conceal their tracks, knowing we would only find their point of exit at first light, by which time they'd be long gone. We knew from the tread patterns of their shoes that it was most likely the same 3 poachers each time, but we remained completely at a loss as to how or where they were gaining entry without us seeing something. The tally to date was 6 incursions, with this latest having resulted in the loss of a huge white rhino bull, something we ascertained by backtracking the poachers and locating the carcass, from which vital forensic evidence was then collected. One morning I received a call from our rhino monitor Lisa Truman and her team to say they had seen suspicious footprints in the soft floodplain soil close to the CARE Primate Rehabilitation Centre across the river, not far upstream from my office. Admittedly, I was rather sceptical of this information, as it was nearly 8 kilometres upstream from where poachers usually crossed, an area our field rangers seldom patrolled, as it was a fair distance from our reserve's core white rhino habitat. But having learned over the years that when dealing with white rhinos, anything is possible, we went to investigate as a matter of course. January was quick to pick up the spoor on our side and confirmed the estimated time of entry. 3 people had indeed crossed the river into our reserve in the early hours of that morning. They wore shoes with patterns that were consistent with those we had become chillingly familiar with. 2 wore all-star running shoes and 1 wore combat boots. This was the breakthrough we'd been looking for. This was where the bastards were coming in, where they'd been entering with impunity for months, and it was virtually under our noses. On the riverbank, in among some huge boulders, January pointed out where the suspects had sat down out of sight and put their shoes back on after wading through the river. I looked around and suddenly recognized the outcrop. These were the same random boulders Rox and Fricky had hidden behind when simulating a poacher's trail for young Saba to follow nearly 2 years previously. Who would ever have guessed it was at this point, along 18 kilometers of Olifant's river frontage, that the poachers had chosen to cross? Yet more irony unfolded, as this time Saba was put onto the trail of the real thing within meters of where I'd ignorantly pulled her back from Rox and Fricky's scent trail when she was little more than a puppy. Although we were well into autumn, it seemed the sun was reluctant to relinquish its grip on summer. It was already past midday at this point. Our best estimation had the poachers more than 8 hours ahead of us, which gave them an edge. Keeping Saba wet helped keep her cool and focused on the scant scent trail which led us high into rocky terrain. On a ridge in the shade of a shepherd's tree we discovered where the poachers had sat down, rested, and eaten some maize meal. The most interesting clue they'd left behind, besides a few maize crumbs, was a fly switch, which one of them had plucked from a silver raisin bush, the leaves of which had only just begun to wilt. This was as close as we'd been to these bastards for months. Until shortly before that point it was apparent the poachers had no idea we were closing in. However, when they saw the Jabiru aircraft quietly circling overhead, giving us air support, the suspects must have known we were onto them. Any plans this gang had been hatching were summarily abandoned, as they swallowed a last mouthful of maize meal, turned and fled. Within an hour they'd made it back across the river, some 4 kilometers upstream, and escaped our pursuit. Adrenaline-fueled, carbohydrate-loaded, and fitter than most of us, it was impossible to keep up with him. Letting Saba go on the scent never entered my mind. Even the real prospect of her catching up with the poachers without our encumbrance was not worth the risk. Benny was in a meeting, and the other helicopter was out. It just wasn't our day. But at least the rhino was safe for the time being, and this gang's entry point was now exposed. Happy that they were put to flight with a determined show of force, I couldn't help wishing they'd gone to ground and chanced their luck, hoping to stay hidden until nightfall, in which scenario I'm sure Saba would have flushed them. After all, she had a point to prove. She had some unfinished business from when I mistrusted her nose at those same boulders over 2 years ago. A Christmas to Remember, page 309. As far back as I can remember, the festive season in the low-veld region has been the polar opposite of weather conditions traditionally associated with Christmas. What little wind dares to blow simply circulates the hot air like a fan in a huge convection oven. However, in the days leading up to the end of 2014, any ambient discomfort we may have felt was the least of our concerns. We were already sweating about something that would show no respite, irrespective of any drop in temperature or humidity. Instead of the airwaves carrying messages of goodwill to all men, nothing but tidings of ill intent came filtering through on Christmas Eve. The butterfly-shaped leaves of the mopane trees fluttered ominously as the Bushveld Telegraph warned of 3 rhino poachers planning an incursion into the reserve later that night. Apparently they would be entering Olifants north, and the 2 rhino that walked together were their target. Needless to say, the intimacy of the reference to the specific rhino had us particularly worried. At the same time, I was concerned that this informant-sourced intelligence was unusually specific and could well have been misinformation thrown out there purposely to mislead us. Anxious doesn't begin to describe the prevailing mood among the anti-poaching rangers. So, acting purely on a hunch, we decided to focus on our own front line, just in case. What little rain we'd received for the season had fallen intermittently and far too gently to cause the runoff needed to raise the level of the Olifants River. We knew that low water meant wading would be easy and the poachers were coming, but exactly when and where along this extensive river front they would cross was anyone's guess. As might be expected over the holidays, a number of our staff were on leave, including members of our Field Ranger anti-poaching unit, which left us rather thin on the ground. Essentially, we were operating with a skeleton force, something that in all likelihood was also known to the poachers. Dawn broke on that Christmas day, typically clear and windless. Although I'd been awake since 3:30 a.m., I had waited a couple of hours before contacting our field rangers posted at the bridge, asking them to check the floodplain very carefully for tracks. Sure enough, less than an hour later they informed me they'd located the spoor of 3 suspects who had crossed the Olifants into our reserve the night before. This meant the poachers had a head start on us of at least 10 hours. My chest tightened. I knew that in this game of cat and mouse, 10 hours can be a lifetime. Our field rangers were immediately alerted and mobilized, and then tactically deployed. 2 of the men took a vehicle and moved to the river floodplain where the spoor was first detected. They would stay with our team of master trackers and provide logistical support, vehicle mobility, communications and supplies, etc. We needed to ascertain the general direction the tracks were headed in, and I needed a reliable link between our field rangers on the river and those deployed inland. We scoured the boundary firebreak of the general area, comprising approximately 150 square kilometers, where our rhino were known to be targeted. Even without anti-tracking subterfuge, the aptly named Klipheuvel, Stone Hill area makes for extremely difficult tracking conditions. Added to this, the temperature was fast approaching 40 degrees, and any moisture evident in the scuffed earth was burned off to blend in quickly with the surrounding soil. Then, as the sun climbed to its midday position, there was little or no shadow being cast to reveal any vestige of spoor. However, persistence paid off, and by leapfrogging on the trail, the team were able to determine that the poachers had crossed under the 4 pylons, heading southeast into prime white rhino area. I'd called for a helicopter at 6 a.m., but the only one available was being used to work on a rhino elsewhere early that morning. In the meantime, we carried on with strategic ground operations and deployment tactics. At about 10 a.m., the deafening cacophony of cicadas quickly faded to background noise, as the distant sound of a helicopter's rotor blades took centre stage. What a comforting sound in a crisis! Seconds later, Jerry MacDonald of Big Game Heli swooped in with his R-44 and was soon flying grid search patterns over the area. When we are sure there is an incursion, it becomes a hot pursuit situation. All the available field rangers are deployed in a focused manhunt, and whenever possible we call in for helicopter support. This combination has proved to be the most effective disruptive tactic to thwart daylight poaching forays. The helicopter is there primarily to keep the poachers' heads down while we buy time tracking them, and secondly to locate rhino carcasses, if there are any. Nothing discourages even the most determined poachers from following through with their intended hunt quite like a helicopter in the air. Flying a grid search pattern for over an hour revealed no carcasses and no vulture activity. Instead, we saw 8 healthy rhino, 4 sable bulls in the wash below one of the main waterholes, and a few buffalo wallowing in the mud near a windmill-fed pan. But this wasn't a game-viewing flight, nor did we hold out any hope of even a glimpse of our target. We all knew it was virtually impossible to detect a hidden poacher from the air. However, when field rangers and master trackers are able to pinpoint an area where they know poachers are hiding, we call in the heli. And while it hovers like a hawk-eagle waiting for a partridge to break cover, the poachers are challenged and told to come out, or else. This had worked well on 2 occasions in the Cesare Nature Reserve, and 6 arrests were made like this. To the best of my knowledge, no one I knew at the time had used dogs to trail rhino poachers successfully in this kind of situation on scent alone. And I remember thinking what a huge asset it would be, never dreaming that in a few hours my Saba would make local history. We were flying over prime white rhino country, focusing on the area where the poachers were most likely to be at this point in time, hoping to pick up any clue to their general location. Incidentally, in all the Kruger Park's patrols and hot pursuit operations, only once have hidden poachers been detected from the air. In this instance, an Augusta helicopter had flown low over the poachers without seeing them. Then, losing his nerve, one of the poachers had pulled his exposed lower leg into the bush. The rest of his body was concealed in. That tiny movement was spotted by a casual backward glance from a sharp-eyed ranger, and the rest, as they say, is history. Primarily, we use a helicopter to let the poachers know we know they are there, and are determined to thwart their plans. Most importantly, that if they shot a rhino, we'd be onto them. It would be a showdown in which they'd be taken down and shown no mercy. However, having come straight to us from its earlier charter, the helicopter needed to head back to refuel. At around 45 degrees in the shade, hunting conditions would be more difficult, even for determined poachers, so we predicted that they would rest up and try to kill a rhino in the hour or 2 before last light. To counter this, we'd planned to keep the helicopter in the air until sundown, so I asked Jerry to return at 5 p.m. Tactics aside, I simply did not want to lose a rhino that day. Jerry is a family man, and on Christmas Day I felt for him. But he never skipped a beat. Come to think of it, I have never seen him without a smile on his face. Keeping cool was on every living creature's mind at the time, including the poachers. It was so hot that your eyelids cooled over your eyeballs when you blinked. Neither a leaf shook nor a creature stirred. It didn't take rocket science to figure out that prime focal points for rhino and the bastards intent on killing them would be the well-used waterholes and cool mud wallows. On a hunch, I suggested to the team leader that he place a 2-man team at each of the 4 water points in the area and provide surveillance cover at all the known rhino middens and stretching posts close by. So, while the rest of the world sat down to Christmas lunch and pulled crackers in celebration, our reserve's field rangers settled into their positions and concealed themselves in whatever shade they could find. There they sat, quietly sipping blood-warm water, watching and waiting. Back at home I sat down with the family for lunch and underplayed what was happening. I didn't want to spoil the day for them. Only Megan, who reads me like a book, guessed that something was about to go down when she noticed I hadn't touched a drop of wine or champagne and had only eaten some cold smoked trout, which I cannot resist. I had even ignored the tempting trifle and Christmas pudding. I knew to stay hydrated and only eat lightly today. After lunch I went back to the Land Cruiser and checked my gear again. I pulled the portable radios, now fully recharged, out of their chargers and repacked the cooler with ice. The thermometer under the carport measured 42 degrees. I thought about my field rangers out in the bush and sympathized with them. Saba was lying in the shade outside on the lawn, ears cocked and panting. She was watching my every move. Well, until distracted by my daughter Eliana, who came out to play with her. Saba will leave her food to play with a ball or frisbee. Besides play, Eliana has been responsible for all Saba's party trick training, namely high fives and lately using both front paws, high tens. She has the uncanny knack of eliciting complete focus from Saba and is able to train her with minimum effort. Maybe one day I'll headhunt her from her accounting firm and have her go into full-time dog training with me. At about 3 p.m., the 2 field rangers at the waterhole known as Mbiri Dam saw one of the poachers, stripped to his waist, furtively approach the water's edge on the other side of the dam. Hearts pounded noisily in their chests as they watched an embodiment of the status these treacherous poachers had earned as apparitions crouched at the water's edge filling a water bottle.
Track 44.
Here was a hot, thirsty man in plain sight, not a nocturnal phantom with the magical power of invisibility. Just then the radio, which had been silent up until that point, crackled into life, shattering the sticky silence. The poacher and his 2 comrades immediately took off, running through the bush in the direction of the 4 power lines. Knowing the poachers were not superhuman, that they not only felt the heat but also the fear of being pursued and captured, the field rangers gave chase with renewed vigour. But with a head start of nearly 200 metres, the bush closed in behind the fleeing men, quickly absorbing them and any signs of their passage. At least we had an immediate point of departure and a direction. Most importantly, the poachers were on the run with escape rather than rhino poaching on their minds. Racing to a strategic point near an expansive open area known as Jackal Plains took just over 15 minutes in the cruiser. Here I waited, commanding a 360-degree view and hoping to get a glimpse of the poachers as they made a run for the river, but no such luck. The thinking then was that the poachers had decided to keep to the thick bush, so I made my way to meet up with the team leader and some of his rangers. They had tried to leapfrog the poachers and were much further north along the 4 pylons, hoping to cut off their escape. When I caught up to the team, I could see they were dangerously dehydrated. In the excitement of the chase, they had focused on the job at hand and neglected to stay hydrated. Nevertheless, a few litres of cold water, Coke, energy bars and jubes from my grab bag soon had them replenished. I radioed Olifant's base and asked to have more water and ice brought from the office, together with a spare ground-to-air radio for those teams following the poachers. No doubt they would need it to communicate to Jerry and his helicopter later on. While everybody caught their breath, I decided to call the helicopter in earlier than scheduled. At 4 p.m., Jerry and the team leader were circling over the Mbiri Dam area. The aerial search was supported by one of our neighbouring landowners in his fixed-wing Jabiru. Circling over the area where the first contact with the poachers was made, the helicopter crew spotted a day pack and some clothing on the ground. Those field rangers closest to that point were then quickly called in and directed to the location in order to secure it. I'd also picked up this communication on my radio and raced along a shortcut I knew of that would shave minutes off the usual route. I was more than just a little curious to get a look at the bag and its contents. At last here was something tangible at least, and sweaty and stinky at best. Arriving at the scene, I found the area swarming with field rangers, milling about like a pack of foxhounds, waiting for the master of the hounds to finish his sherry, sound the bugle, and commence the hunt. Needless to say, the poacher's scent, or rather what was left of it, had been inadvertently contaminated by our own men's spoor. The wash from the helicopter rotors and the hot, dry conditions didn't help matters either. Nevertheless, I phoned Megan and asked her to load Saba and meet me under the 4 pylons as soon as she could. About 20 minutes later, Saba was with me. Quickly slipping on her tracking harness, I took her to where the helicopter had first located the bag. Belgian Malinois have particularly expressive ears, and the attitude of hers spoke volumes. Saba had never seen so many field rangers at one location. The atmosphere was filled with expectation, and she could sense this was not a routine training exercise, particularly when I pulled a shirt belonging to one of the poachers from the pack and used it as a scent clue for her to sniff. Saba needed no more than a whiff for her brain to register the scent and memorize it. "Sook, sook," I told her, and she set off at a run, with me trailing her on the end of the 10-metre tracking line. Following closely behind me were 3 armed field rangers, which was reassuring to say the least. Besides a 2-way radio and my cell phone, all I carried was plenty of water for Saba. Even though it was cumbersome and heavy, I knew it was essential. It was still sweltering hot, and I had no idea how long we would be on the poacher's trail. After about a kilometre of confident trailing, Saba stopped and, turning hard to the right, stuck her nose into a dense thicket. "Oh, shit," I thought, hoping it wasn't a sounder of warthogs, which loved to lie under just this type of dense thicket to get out of the heat. With hair bristling on her back and rump, she barked at what appeared to be a small greenish bag wedged deep in the dense tangle of undergrowth. Gathering the slack on the tracking line, I moved in closer to investigate. It was then that the bag moved. Saba could hardly contain herself. Something in her prey drive registered that this was a potentially dangerous situation. I'd never seen her like this before. As I strained to focus through sweat-filled eyes, I could see this bag was in fact a greenish overall trouser leg, the wearer of which blended invisibly into the darkness of the undergrowth. This was all I could make out, until the form of a man began to emerge, half crawling, half wriggling, all the while trying to lift his hands in surrender. However, the bush was so thick it hampered his attempts to do much more than lie there while 3 rifles were trained on him and Saba held onto his ankle. He begged for mercy and apologized profusely as the field rangers dragged him out into the open and placed him in handcuffs. Then, making him more comfortable on his knees, he was offered water and treated with a tad more empathy than he'd planned to show our rhino that day. A bird in the hand was not worth the 2 still lurking in the bush, as far as we were concerned. And now, motivated in no small measure by Saba's success, we all wanted to capture the other poachers as well. So, while a team of field rangers focused on the arrested suspect, a pair of smelly trousers was pulled from his pack and shoved in Saba's face. Once again the magic wool words were uttered, and again she took off at a run. We tracked with her for another kilometre or so, heading north on the trail of the other 2 suspects. And although Saba was tracking at a slower, more deliberate pace, we simply could not keep up with her. At this point, everyone was absolutely exhausted. We needed to accept that our enthusiasm had exceeded our physical ability. So, with the light fading, we reluctantly called it a day. I later found out that both the shirt and the pants belonged to the suspect who Saba had already located. What she was now trailing were merely the dregs of association and the rapidly dwindling scent left by the other 2 when they ran through the bush. I looked at the suspect's ID book, did a quick calculation, and realized just how old I was. But I was pleasantly surprised at how good I felt for 58. It is astonishing what adrenaline can do to a spent old body. Despite having run for a couple of kilometres behind a Belgian Malinois hell-bent on catching rhino poachers, I felt light on my feet and swollen with pride at Saber's incredible achievement. Nothing else in the world mattered at that point. The day's heat began to relent as the sun began to lose its brassy glare. I went over to the suspect and made sure the handcuffs were secure. Shortly afterwards, the team leader loaded him into the van and drove him to the police station in Hoedspruit, where he was duly charged and processed. There were a number of positives to take away from this incident. Most importantly, no rhino were lost that day, and the morale of our field rangers was lifted high as a result. Useful information was gleaned from the suspect while he was held in custody, and his cell phone provided a number of leads to further investigations. For me, one of the most important results of the day's success was the message about the suspect's experience on olifants. This is a word-of-mouth message that will spread from tavern to tavern and from one beer hall to another. Inadvertently, he will become our greatest ambassador by instilling caution in the minds of any wannabe poachers contemplating giving us a go. Olifants River Game Reserve will become known as a place to avoid, where you are literally hounded down and caught, where despite the conditions no quarter will be given and no expense spared in the effort to protect the rhino. Last, but not least, was Saber's role in that day's success. For most canines, this result ranks up there with those once-in-a-lifetime achievements. Rhino poachers are elusive and unpredictable trail layers. They give nothing away. Every tiny clue is hard won. Trailing elusive killers in the sweltering African bush, as Saber did that day, has to be the epitome of a tracking challenge for any dog. Countless hours of focused training since she was 8 weeks old were brought to bear and, when combined with her inherent qualities, culminated in success. Saber came of age at just 17 months old. I got home and celebrated, but not in the conventional sense. Rather, I gathered my family, including Saber, around me, and poured myself an ice-cold Windhoek light and relayed the afternoon's events in as much detail as I could remember. Obviously, Saber will never know what she had achieved that day. To her, I suspect this was not much more than a seriously fun but rather intense sook. Her tail wagging and ears back, she now appeared to be more focused on the dish of roast turkey thrust in front of her, gravy and all. Megan had gone to considerable pains roasting the huge bird in a somewhat temperamental oven, but was quick to help carve off pieces to be chopped up and given to Saber. Each of us had sacrificed some of our turkey for her. After all, she was also one of the family, and it was Christmas Day. I was overwhelmed with her achievement, and though I seldom post anything on social media, I thought to post the simple image taken on my cell phone of her success and to share it with those who visited my Facebook page. Accompanying the photo, which went viral, I wrote the following. Most of you woke on Christmas Day to find Santa's boot prints in the snow after he'd filled your stockings with presents. I, too, found boot prints on Christmas morning. But these were not Santa's, and they were not in the snow. These were the footprints of rhino poachers left in the sand when they entered the reserve in order to kill rhino. Despite extremely difficult conditions, and at a little over 17 months, Saber rose to the occasion. On her first attempt at the real thing, she successfully trailed the suspects, resulting in an arrest and no rhino lost. How could I possibly wish for more? To my utter amazement, this post was viewed by nearly 1.3 million people from every corner of the globe in less than 4 days, and there were more than 5,000 likes posted. What this proved beyond any doubt was that as great as the world's love for our canine companions and their achievements was the universal abhorrence of rhino poachers. I hypothesized from this reaction that a lynch mob comprising 1,000 social media users from all corners of the globe and from all walks of life would be virtually unanimous in their selection of a candidate for the noose. Recognition of excellence manifests in many ways: awards, medals, prizes, and certificates of achievement. Saba needed none of these trappings as a measure of her ability. These days my grab bag has a companion, a second, smaller bag added to what I grab, which comprises a day pack containing all the spare equipment Sama may need out in the bush, including 2 liters of water, a spare harness and lead, a plastic bowl, tinned dog food, biscuits, and a towel. And despite her achievement and a flood of congratulations, I was most humbled by a single compliment paid to Saba by her breeder. Agnes drove all the way from Johannesburg to visit Saba for a couple of days, and like a doting grandmother who just couldn't get enough of her granddaughter, I saw genuine pride and love for her dog. Recently I was contacted by Lenteruda, who owns Kapama. This huge game reserve just outside Hoedspruit is home to a number of rhino that, needless to say, have also been targeted by poachers. In desperation, Lenta turned to Jonathan Swartz, who, as I said earlier, helped me with Saba's basic training when she was a puppy. Lenta told me that Jonathan had suggested she contact me for some background on Saba as an example of what could be achieved, for practical advice and suggestions as to which canines and what training focus she would need in their particular situation. What a compliment! However, before strutting around with my chest out, I had to ask myself whether this was as a result of Jonathan's faith of me as his protégé, or in the Malinoise's ability. I strongly suspect it was the latter. Like fishermen who don't give away a good fishing hole's location, the independent gangs of poachers clearly don't share information on rhino whereabouts or anti-poaching details. The result is that they unknowingly enter the reserve to risk it all for a chance to kill a rhino, as we found out when, exactly 1 month after the Christmas Day incident, another incursion occurred and the same area was targeted by rhino poachers. Again, early detection by our foot patrols and helicopter patrols, sponsored by shareholders of the reserve, were effective in letting the poachers know that we knew they were there and were now hunting them. Frikkie Kotze brought his bloodhound, Ranger, in on the faint chance of getting a scent trail. His bloodhound sounded as only these wonderful hounds can do. Any poacher crouched in hiding within a kilometre radius would have heard the baying and known someone had let the dogs out. Saba joined Ranger on the trailing patrol, but with no scent clue to follow, we were simply hoping for the best. Neither dog picked up anything positive, but both appeared to be trailing a faint airborne scent that led in the same general northerly direction, indicating the poachers had done an about turn and headed back to the river. Trusting the dogs' noses, as I have learned to do, this gave us a modicum of comfort that at least no poachers would be targeting our rhino that day. It was now midday, and the heat was beginning to exert its limiting role on canine performance, so without anything strong to trail, we called it quits. I got back to Olifants in time to drop off Saba, attend to a wounded zebra, take a quick shower, and rendezvous with our reserve's chairman, as together we drove off to attend a Baluli Nature Reserve committee meeting. Later that night, one of the camera traps sent us a chilling image of the 3 poachers we had chased that day. All were leaving empty-handed, but were clearly armed and ready for any possible confrontation with our field rangers. We must have rattled them that morning, and as a result they appeared to be anticipating an ambush. Anyway, at the very least we could sleep easy for a while. Until the New Year's onslaught, which, thanks to Saba, we will be that much more ready to tackle. And there are no prizes for guessing what my New Year's resolution is going to be. Acknowledgements. Page 321. Writing this book has been an important undertaking. It has also been an opportunity to pay tribute to those faceless men and women in the front line of the war against rhino poaching, mostly battle-hardened rangers, who stand resolute while defending an island of wildlife in a sea of crisis. Penetrating the shroud of modesty and understatement to reveal the realities beneath the veneer of romanticism generally associated with this illustrious career has been a privilege. I have also made mention of people on the security front who have been integral to its compilation. To those colleagues and associates, too numerous to list individually here, and for fear of inadvertently leaving someone out, I use collective terms such as the Baluli Regional Wardens and their field rangers, Protrac's anti-poaching units, and the Black Mambas. To you all, I wish to convey my sincere gratitude. The ability to track rhino poachers, who use every anti-tracking tactic known to escape detection, is undoubtedly one of the most useful skills we employ.
Track 45.
Oliphant's team of field rangers, in particular the unequalled, expert tracking ability of January Matlauli, combined with Joachim Timani and Jabulan Makubedu's instincts, are singled out with accolades and sincere gratitude. Their ability to think like poachers has led to hundreds of disrupted forays and a number of dramatic arrests. Needless to say, as a result, this team has been directly responsible for saving the lives of many rhino. My sincere gratitude goes to Craig Spencer for his pragmatic approach and dedication to nature conservation. Besides his responsibilities as CEO of Transfrontier Africa, he steers the rudder at the helm of Baluli's Wardens Committee with a firm hand, wickedly quick wit, and sense of humour. Craig also conceived and manages the now world-famous Black Mambas, all-women anti-poaching team. And, biased as this may seem, he has earned my personal respect for his unconditional love of his 3-legged Malinois named Shire. Thank you to the WWF's Dr. Jacques Flamand for his faith in the Baluli Warden's ability to conserve and manage some of the most threatened and beleaguered animals in the world. Monitoring Baluli's rhino on a daily basis has been vital to their management and security. To this end, my grateful appreciation to Sinclair Matabula, Leonie Hofstra, Lisa Truman, and Zala Hajdingjak, all of whom have endured the often difficult conditions associated with gathering data in the bush. Then to Melody Ahlers, who compiles the data in informative monthly reports, thank you. Thanks to Johan Grabela and the late Jason Sherwood, who took on the arduous task of policing the most hostile regions with good effect. Also to Vincent Barkas and Shane Tindiger of Protrac, who take charge of the autopsies associated with poaching incidents. Thank you for doing this unenviable but necessary task. My grateful thanks to the wildlife vets we depend on, all of whom at very short notice, and often under trying circumstances, come to our calls for assistance. Namely, Dr. Peter Rogers, his assistant Janelle Goodrich, Dr. Gerrit Skeppers, Dr. Sampi Ras, and Dr. Hein Müller. A huge debt of gratitude for the quick response to our requests for airborne assistance by Big Game Heli's intrepid helicopter pilots, the late Benjamin Osmers, Benny, Zander Osmers, Jerry MacDonald, and Marcus Phillip. These machines in the hands of these men are key to our anti-poaching efforts and general wildlife conservation work. I dread to think what we'd do without them. This is yet another opportunity to thank the Olifants River Game Reserves Board members and shareholders for placing their trust and resolute faith in my management of our field ranges to take care of their piece of Africa and all its wildlife. I am encouraged by and grateful for the world's increasing awareness and abhorrence of the killing of its endangered wildlife, not the least being the NGOs that raise funds to combat rhino poaching through exposure and awareness campaigns. There is a sense of superiority bordering on extreme arrogance that prevails among some of the world's most populous and intelligent peoples, who paradoxically believe in the traditions and medicinal powers of rhino horn. Worse, it is perceived as their right to acquire rhino horn, by whatever means, while fully cognizant of the dire consequences left in the wake to fulfill these spurious needs. I believe that in the near future those directly responsible for the extinction of a species will be called to an international court to account for their crimes, acts that may soon be viewed in the same light as genocide and war crimes are today. The more support we can muster, the better. To the little girl whose name I cannot recall, who sent $2 all the way from the USA to bolster our rhino anti-poaching fund. And not to forget those individuals who have made relatively large donations in difficult financial times. Thank you. Little drops of water, little grains of sand. In Italian culture, it is all about la familia, and that's what the team at Jonathan Ball Publishers have become. My gratitude to all involved with this, my third publication. To Publishing Director Jeremy Borain, whose guidance regarding the subject material for this book has been invaluable. Commissioning Editor Sophie Kohler was emotionally moved by the importance of the content, which alone would have been enough to warm my heart. In addition, Editor Francis Perrier later added that the manuscript had a very good feel. Knowing how absorbed Francis became in editing the manuscript, it was the cherry on top for me. The layout and setting of the publication will be in the skilled hands of Seri Prenter and Kevin Shenton, for which I am grateful. And last, but by no means least, thanks to my tolerant family, to my children, Eliana and Dino, and my wife Megan, who have endured the countless hours of my burning midnight oil in its compilation, and of course my beloved dog Saba, whose achievements have made me extremely proud. This is the end of the recording of Heart of a Game Ranger by Mario Cesare, read by Frank Collier. If you have enjoyed this recording, perhaps you would like to listen to the following. P1814, All the Way Home by Bookie Peak. A1322, Elephant Whisperer by Lawrence Anthony. K1312, Matlangeni by Kirby Krieger. In consideration for other library members, please ensure that all cassettes or CD discs belonging to this book are replaced in the container and returned to the main circulation library in Durban. Should you, members of your family or friends, wish to sponsor the recording of a book for our library, please contact Tapeades for the Blind in Durban on 031 309 4800. It has been a pleasure for Tapeades to be associated with this production.